to put people back to where they were before. Or in some cases, we want to actually elevate them, right? So like when you rehab a broken shoulder, you're trying to get it back to the earlier spot. But sometimes we're talking about very often folks who've been victimized themselves. So do we want to put them back to that position where, prior to them committing the harm? Or do we actually want something else entirely that enables them to address the kind of trauma that might have contributed to it? So I have been trying to think hard about whether I want to frame a system around a notion of rehabilitation or something else. So I'm open to other words if anyone has anything in mind, has other alternatives. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mia, and I'm going to be a rising senior. And the reason I decided to join YVote because I was really interested in how like a young person can impact the world by just voting. And the reason I chose to come in criminal justice is because I'm really passionate towards this cause, because I feel that people of color who face prosecution and who face indiscrimination and they're not given jobs or opportunities, they should get rights because they're people too, and I feel how I as an individual can impact their lives and make it better. And also in my own way, how I can make an impact by educating others on issues such as gender discrimination and girls being sexually assaulted, and how I can make an impact and raise awareness to people. So that's why I decided to join.
I'm Farida, and the reason I'm interested in criminal justice, I guess when I began to become more aware about the cyclical nature of prison and how, like the prison pipeline and how, if you're from a low-income community, your zone school is probably low income and low funded too, and then you're more likely to engage in behavior that gets you into prison, and when you come out, like what you were just talking about, you're put in the place you were right before you were in prison, not in a better place to go forward. And I guess like I immediately saw something wrong with the system that was cyclic, like wasn't like, it was more like to put you back in the same spot so you could go through it all over again. And I think clearly there's something very wrong in that, and that's what drew my interest initially. So and that's part of a greater problem, like housing discrimination, which in turn leads to, the lack of not even access to education, but how our schools are so segregated, and then who actually gets into prison after high school and things like that. And yeah, that's what drew my interest.
Gosh, there's so many things embedded in those observations, and I think that it sounds like you're right on track to become a criminal justice advocate, which is great because we need more. The cyclical problem is so huge, and one of the big challenges of being any individual government system actor is you feel like you only have responsibility for a slice of the system, right? So the reason that I started doing the class I was describing for you is because I realized that someone would get arrested, they'd be brought to my office, I would do the lawyering and figure out what the right charges were and file them. Then I would spend the next few months litigating the legal issues, assessing the merits of the case, and make an offer, often that involved prison. Sometimes it involved a program, depending on what the circumstances were. And then the person would plead guilty, or they would go to trial. That would conclude. They would be sentenced, and then I didn't think about it again because it wasn't really up to me. And then I would get an email 4 years later that so-and-so's been locked up again, often for some version of the same conduct. I mean, that to me, and it sounds like to you, Rita, is a failing system. And what we have to do to be able to fix it is to think beyond what we talk about as a sort of silos of the system. And now I've been talking a lot more about prosecutors taking responsibility for the conditions in prison. And that's a kind of radical thought, because they're very different agencies and prosecutors don't actually have any real control over it. But when you think about prosecutors, for example, or cops being almost like ER doctors, the people who are like at the front lines of a a health crisis or a tragedy, and that we are the people who then decide, you know, who's getting admitted to the hospital. Well, if the hospital that we were admitting them to was actually making the conditions worse, the hospital would be put out of business, right? And the fact that we don't think about prisons in that way, I think, is really problematic. And I think that you're exactly right, that the cyclical nature of it is what makes it so unconscionable. I mean, that's how we know it's broken, right? Other folks have